Hello everybody, welcome to the very first mini lecture for Lab 1 of AP150. In this first lab and in the set of mini lectures that accompany it, basically what we're trying to do is just introduce you to the human body and how it's organized and talk about some terminology. Again, it's supposed to give you just a basic framework to fit the upcoming details into. Right? So in this particular video, we're going to look at anatomical position, the terms of position and location, and then in future videos, we will look at the anatomical planes, we'll look at body cavities, and then we'll move on into organs, organ systems, and regional terms. Let's go ahead and get started. So when we look at this diagram of this person is in what we call anatomical position. It's a fairly intuitive position. A body in anatomical position is standing upright, feet relatively together, under the hips, the arms are at the side, they're facing forward. The one thing, or I think the thing to remember is that the palms are facing forward, right? Therefore, the thumbs are facing kind of away from the body. Now, anatomical position is important because when this is the position we assume a body is in, whenever we use this set of terminology, right? So these terms, and you might be familiar with some, if not all of them already, these terms here are terms of position and location. They are used to describe the location of anatomical parts. And whenever we use these terms here in this red box, we use them as if the body is in anatomical position. And this means that these terms will be used consistently all the time. So even if you have a body that's laying down like that, or like that, or like this, you would assume or use these words as if that body were in anatomical position. Okay? Let's go ahead and look at these terms. We're going to approach them in pairs. The first word is anterior, which means on, near, nearer to, or towards the front. Now, something that happens in anatomy is oftentimes there's more than one term for the same idea, and in human anatomy, another word that means the same thing as anterior is ventral. Right? The other term is posterior. Right? That means on, near, nearer, or toward the back. And a word that means the same thing as posterior in human anatomy is the word dorsal. Right? And so if something is in the forward direction, it is anterior. And if something is more towards the back, it is posterior. Right? Let's just look at one or two examples using just common names for some familiar body parts. We're not going to get too technical at this point. You could say that the chest is anterior to the back. Or you could say the buttock is posterior to the genitalia. Right? So anterior and posterior. Right? The next set of terms is the word superior, which means toward or nearer the head, and the word inferior, which means toward or nearer the feet. Now, interestingly enough, these words are only used in reference to the head and torso. These words are not used in the limbs. Right? We have another set of words that we use in the limbs. So let's go ahead and take a look at a couple of examples, right? So something in the direction of the head would be superior. Something towards the feet would be inferior. Okay? So the nose would be superior to the mouth. Right? And the chin would be inferior to the mouth. Okay? So oftentimes when we use these terms, as you can see, we can use them when we compare the position of one body part relative to another. Right? They can also be used in an absolute sense. Right? For example, the forehead is located superiorly. Right? Two other pairs of anatomical terms are medial and lateral. Both of these terms refer to an imaginary line known as the midline. The midline is an imaginary line that runs right down the center of a person's body, dividing them into identical left and right halves, creating mirror images. Right? It goes through the nose, through the belly button, and out between the legs. The word medial refers to something that is at, near, or close to the midline. Right? Whereas the word lateral means away from the midline. Okay? So you could say, for example, your ears are lateral to your nose, or your belly button is medial to your hip bones. Okay? You can also use these terms on the limbs, right? For example, you can say that the thumb is lateral to the pinky, or you could say that your pinky finger is located on the medial side of your hand. Let's take a look at this image. Right? If I pointed to that location on this person's forearm, would this be the person's medial surface of the forearm, or would that be the lateral surface of the forearm? Let's take a second and think about it. This part of the forearm would be the lateral part of the forearm. The reason is that you need to think about where that arm is going to be if it was in anatomic position, right? If this arm was down in anatomic position, that would be the lateral aspect or the lateral surface of the forearm. Okay? So this is why this is one example of why anatomic position is important to keep in mind. Okay? Right? Now, the term distal and proximal are primarily used on the limbs or the extremities. Okay? Now, they can also be used in reference to the flow of a material or the flow of an event, but at this point in the semester, we're only going to use the term distal and proximal to refer to the location or the position of an anatomical part. Okay? So distal and proximal are used on the limbs, and in this sense, the word distal means away from the trunk. Right? In other words, away from the torso. Right? Think of the word distal as kind of being similar or having the same root word as distant. Okay? It's far away. Right? The word proximal means near the trunk. Right? And think of the word proximal as having the same root as proximity, right? In other words, something is close, right? Right? So let's take a look at some examples. For example, the first one, let's look at the fingertips. Would the fingertips be described as being located proximally or distally? Take a second. Okay. The fingertips are far away from where the upper limb attaches to the trunk. Therefore, the fingertips are distal. Right? Whereas the shoulder is close to where the upper limb attaches. So that would be proximal. Right? Let's take a look at some examples using the lower limb, and here we'll make some comparisons. We could say that the knee is proximal to the ankle, right? But we could say that the ankle is proximal to the tips of the toes, right? Because between the ankle and the toes, the ankle is closer to the point of origin. Right? We could say that between the hip, or actually, let's do this one. We could say that between the thigh and the knee is distal to the thigh, because the knee is further away from the point of attachment or origin than the thigh is. The last two terms are deep and superficial. The word deep means away from the surface, towards the interior. Superficial means toward the surface, right? Where it's more external. So if we look here at this image, this is the head cut open, and you can see the brain, you can see a layer of bone, and you can see a layer of skin, right? So the skin of your skull is located superficially, whereas the brain is located deeply. Again, we can use these terms in relative or comparative senses. For example, the bones of your skull are superficial to the brain, whereas the skin is superficial to the bone of the skull. Or we could say the bone of the skull is deep to the skin, because the bones of the skull are further away from the surface than the skin is. Right? So that's it for the terms. I'll see you, or you'll hear from me in the next mini lecture.